And year after year, on the fifth night of Chanukah, is the time to read this story, to share this story. And so I'd like to share it with you. I'm going to read quickly because it's long, and we want to get through it and try to stick with me. Here is the story. From the Hebrew Weekly, Shvo'on Kfar Chabad, a wondrous account sent in by Rav Moshe Chaim Greenwald 18 years ago. And he says, since the passing of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, may his merit guard over us, Jews all around me of every stripe and persuasion can't seem to stop talking about the Rebbe. This was soon after the Rebbe was nifter, a year or two. He sent it in 18 years ago, but it's from a longer time. At the synagogue I pray at work, it amazes me to see how every Jew seems to have a story about a personal encounter or experience with the Rebbe. I say it's a mitzvah to tell these stories so that our children and children's children will hear about the sanctification of God's name by means of a tzaddik who walked amongst us and was a faithful shepherd for all the children of the generation. It's widely known that Hasidim place great importance on tales of the righteous, as is written, praise the Lord, O ye servants of the Lord. In order to comply with this precept myself, I offer a wondrous account about the Rebbe and my father. Until now, this was known only in our family circles. I now find it at this time incumbent upon me, after the Rebbe's passing, to tell this story publicly. Listen to this. Mind-boggling. It's totally mind-blowing. My father of Avram Tzvi Greenwald was born in Lodz, Poland, and was orphaned from his father at the age of 8. His mother was left with 7 little orphans, and she worried very much about the education of her eldest boy, whom she sent to live with a cousin, the exalted scholar Reb Nachum Ziemba. May God avenge his blood, who was murdered in the ghetto, famously. It was he who raised my father with great self-sacrifice. Understandably, he was concerned about my father's studies and even tutored him personally. My father was almost 17 years old when there took place in Warsaw the great wedding, the nuptials of the daughter of the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Isaac, Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the Rayatz, who was the Rebbe's father-in-law, with Rabbi Nachum Mendel Schneerson, who would later become the 7th Rebbe. This was the Rebbe's wedding. My father used to tell about this wedding almost as a spiritual exercise, both regarding the wedding itself, in which participated the cream of Polish Hasidic leaders, and also that my father was able to meet personally with the young bridegroom. So he met the chassin, which was Lubavitcher Rebbe, at his wedding. This meeting, my father would later realize, would portend much in the future. This is a remarkable story, guys. I'm telling you, this is a remarkable story. So he's meeting the Rebbe the day of his wedding. And listen to how far, at the Rebbe's wedding, how old was he? 23, 24? How old was the Rebbe when he got married? Decades into the future, at that young age. Listen to this. My father could not remember and repeat all that the two spoke about, but he did remember well the end of the conversation before these two personalities parted ways. The Rebbe turned to my father. Again, this is the Rebbe at a young age, at the day of his wedding. Turned to my father and said, in another few days it will be Chanukah. Do you know why so many small synagogues hold festivals, get-togethers on the 5th night of Chanukah? My father did not know what to answer, and he recalled that Reb Zemba just looked at the Rebbe waiting for an answer. Then the Rebbe turned to my father and said, the 5th Chanukah candle signifies great darkness, because this day cannot fall out on the Holy Shabbos. And through the Chanukah candles, the greatest spiritual darkness of the world is illuminated. And for this reason, the potential of Chanukah comes to fruition specifically through the 5th candle, which signifies the darkness. Because in a certain way, this night is the darkest of all the nights. And if Chanukah is about illuminating the darkness, this night that can never fall out on Shabbos, that's the way the calendar falls out, is illuminated dafka by the Chanukah Neiros, by the 5th candle, which is the pinnacle of Chanukah. And he says, listen to these words, and this is the function of every Jew in every place, in Warsaw or London, to illuminate the darkest place. As mentioned earlier, my father did not remember what the Rebbe and Reb Zemba spoke about during their long conversation, also a fascinating thing to think about. But he said he would never forget that the tractates of the Babylonian Talmud flew around the room. When they left the hotel, my father recalls Reb Zemba was extremely excited and didn't stop speaking about the meeting to everyone with whom he conversed for several days. After that meeting, nearly 10 years passed. My father survived the Holocaust, first in the ghetto and afterwards in the death camps. His first wife and their 5 little children were slaughtered in front of his eyes. When the war ended and he was left alive by the grace of God, he experienced a mental and physical breakdown. For 2 years, he moved from DP camp, displaced persons camp, to displaced persons camp, trying to learn if there were relatives close or distant who survived. In the end, it became clear that all of his brothers and sisters, each one of them, was liquidated by the oppressor. May its name be blotted out. In the year 1948, he traveled to the United States to Philadelphia. There lived his uncle, Reb Moshe Chaim Greenwald of the Amshan of Hasidim, whom he had never met because his uncle emigrated to America before he was born. But the uncle arranged my father's travel to the U.S. and received him with great love, and he did everything to make it easier for him and to comfort him after the portion of awesome suffering he underwent. Under pressure from his uncle, with the intervention of the Amshan of Rebbe, my father decided to put his life back together and married a second wife, my mother of blessed memory. My mother was a child of Kharkov, daughter of Reb Zusha Sinkowitz, may God avenge his blood, of the elders of the Alexander Hasidim. Together with his sister, he succeeded in fleeing immediately at the beginning of the war, running from country to country until they set sail for Canada. There, they raised in the house another cousin, the great leader, Mr. Couple Schwartz, one of Toronto's leading Jews. Before my parents were wed, Mr. Schwartz took my father, again his father-in-law, took my father to New York for an audience with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, at that time was still the Rayat, to obtain his blessing. My father told me he trembled to see the change that had overtaken the previous Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rayatz, how age had crept up on him since the Warsaw wedding, so many years before, 10 years earlier. It was difficult to understand the Rebbe's speech. One of the Hasidic elders who stood in the room explained what the Rebbe was saying. Mr. Schwartz told the previous Rebbe that my father had been saved, his future son-in-law had been saved, but lost his family of the Holocaust. Then, from the holy eyes of the previous Rebbe, there began to fall streams of pure tears. The Rebbe blessed my father, wished him a long and good life. Before he left, my father told the Rebbe that he had been fortunate to be at the wedding of his son-in-law, the Rebbe, his son-in-law, right, in Warsaw. Then my father tells the previous Rebbe's eyes brightened, and he said that since his son-in-law lived here, and it was at the wedding, before the wedding, he should certainly visit him to pay his respects. He wasn't yet the Rebbe, but he lived there, he was in charge of communal affairs. Mr. Schwartz and my father left the Rebbe's chambers, and afterwards they were shown where to find the chambers of the Ramash, as he was known then, Rabbi Nachum Mendel Schneers, and they knocked and entered, saying that they came at the instructions of the previous Rebbe, the Rayatz. My father was elated that the Ramash remembered him immediately. His first question was that my father should tell about the last days of Rebbe Zemba, because he heard he was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto but did not know any details. After my father told all he knew, the Ramash said, "Since the Rebbe told you to visit me, I am obligated to say to you words of Torah. And since the month of Kislev is close to Chanukah, it is known that the custom of many Hasidim, followers of the Baal Shem Tov, to celebrate the 5th day of Chanukah. What is the reason? Imagine 10 years later. Since the 5th day can never fall on Shabbos, if so, then it applies strong darkness. This is the potential of the Chanukah candle to illuminate the greatest darkness. This is the mission of every Jew in every place he may be, New York or London, to illuminate the darkest place." Needless to say, my father was startled, as he had all but forgotten the very same thing that the Ramash had told him nearly 20 years ago. And now his memory was jarred, and he remembered, and he realized that the Ramash had repeated almost word for word what he told him then in the hotel in Warsaw. This is a person that he met once for a couple of minutes. After his wedding, my father served as a rabbi and teacher for the congregation at Das Yisrael in Washington Heights. There we were born, my sister and I. My father remained there for some 5 years, and with the help of Mr. Schwartz in Canada, who was his father-in-law, moved to Toronto and worked there as a rabbi and teacher in the Haredi congregation there. Over the course of years in Toronto, my father became close to the Satmar Hasidim in the city. Parenthetically, my grandparents, the Würzburgers, were Satmar Hasidim in Toronto also. It was close to the Satmar Hasidim there. Though he never sent us to the Satmar schools, he sent us to educational institutions that were spiritually similar. Me and my brother were sent to the well-known Nitri Yeshiva. Though my father's outlook was philosophically close to Satmar, he never spoke against Lubavitcher Rebbe Kiyadua. Back then, certainly Satmar and Lubavitch did not get along so much. And so, even though he was close to Satmar, about the Lubavitcher Rebbe he never spoke. On the contrary, he always spoke of him with praise and especially respectful terms, as did his children. In the winter of 1969, I was married. My father told me that even though I wasn't a Lubavitcher Chassid, he feels the need to go with me to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe to receive his blessing for my wedding, just as he had done, even though he had not seen the Rebbe for some 20 years. This means that it is close to 40 years since the first time they met at the Rebbe's own wedding. I agreed with a whole heart, but then I learned it's not so simple to visit the Rebbe. Only after negotiations with the Rebbe's secretary, and only after my father explained to him that we cannot wait several months to reserve a place in the queue for audiences did he agree to place us in line, but only after we promised we would only ask for a bracha and would not detain the Rebbe. It's translated from Hebrew. It's like it sounds a little funny. Detain, like you're going to lock him up, It means not to bog him down, with questions and things. My father promised. We left Toronto on the appointed day. I don't remember the exact hour we entered the Rebbe's chambers, but it was closer to morning than night, if not dawn itself. Kiyadua, the Rebbe would meet people throughout the night, 4 or 5 in the morning. He never slept. The man, Pashit, never slept. Didn't make sense. He was awake all the time. I saw the Rebbe's face for the first time in person. His face, especially his eyes, made a great impression on me. My father gave the Rebbe the customary epistle, which is the kvittel, the little note, which were inscribed the names of myself, my bride-to-be, and my father's request for a bracha. The Rebbe took the kvittel from my father's hands. Before he opened it, he looked at my father with a broad smile. The Lubavitcher Rebbe's smile, if you ever saw. Shines the whole world. And he said, not more than 20 years ago, the time had arrived, especially as the previous Rebbe sent you to me. My father stood scared and trembling and couldn't find the energy to open his mouth. He remembered that it was 20 years earlier that the previous Rebbe, the Rayatz, had sent this person, who was the father-in-law of the father of the speaker, to him on his wedding day, before his wedding. Meanwhile, the Gabbai was banging on the door, but the Rebbe waved his hand as to negate the knocking, like someone who was saying, don't pay attention. In the midst of all this, the Rebbe opened the kvittel, glanced at it, and immediately began to give us his blessing. Blessed my father with a long life and good years, and said roughly, just as you rejoiced at my wedding, may the Lord give you nachas and strength to dance at your grandchild's wedding. Tears poured from my father's eyes, and I was also elated. My father had been physically broken from all he had endured in the camps, and this benediction from the Rebbe was especially dear. Before we left, my father got together the strength to ask the Rebbe that since he had promised the secretary we would enter solely to repeat a blessing, and it was a pressing question, would the Rebbe permit him to ask it? The Rebbe smiled and laughed and said, since the Rebbe, the father-in-law, sent you to me, I am obligated to answer all questions. As before, we heard loud banging at the door, and the Rebbe signaled we should ignore it. My father turned to the Rebbe and said that for different reasons we had lived among the Satmar Hasidim and their fellow travelers for many years. There we frequently heard complaints about the views of Lubavitch. Even though I do not accept all the gossip that I hear, they have nonetheless succeeded in raising within me a great doubt about the Lubavitcher view in connection with working together with Rishaim. The verses are well known, such as, and those that you hate, right, that Hashem hates, Esna, I shall hate. How is it the Lubavitch can openly work together with those who battle against God and His Torah? My father told the Rebbe that he requests forgiveness for the question. He did not mean to offend. Quite the contrary. He really wants to understand the Rebbe's view so he can answer others as well as himself. The Rebbe turned to my father with a question. What would your neighbors do? Every word is, pay attention to every word. What would your neighbors do if a neighbor's daughter began to keep bad company? Would they attempt to return her to the ways of the Torah and the commandments, or would they say, the pasuk, and those who do hate us, the Lord, shall hate, right? And it is forbidden to involve oneself with the wicked, therefore we should distance ourselves from her and not bring her closer. The Rebbe did not wait for an answer and promptly added, the zealous one would answer that with a daughter, the injunction of, from thy flesh, do not conceal thyself, would apply. And then the Rebbe's eyes became serious and he knocked on the table and said, by the Almighty, every Jew is as precious as his only child. With the Rebbe, my father-in-law, every Jew was, from thy flesh do not conceal yourself. Then the Rebbe looked at me and at my father with a constant gaze and he said, one concludes with a blessing. As is known, it is customary among Hasidim to celebrate the 5th day of Chanukah with festivities. What is the reason? Since the 5th day cannot ever fall out on Shabbos, this signifies that it is the height of darkness. With the light of Chanukah candle, it is possible to illuminate the darkest thing. This is the mission of each Jew, to illuminate even the darkest places. It does not matter where he lives, Toronto or London. Every Jew is veritably a part of the God above, the only child of the Holy One, blessed be He. And when one lights his soul with the candle of holiness, even the distant Jew is stirred in the darkest places. My father was startled in the most shocking way. He didn't even hear the last words of the Rebbe's blessing, nor how we left the Rebbe's chambers. All the way back to Toronto, he was silent. Only 2 words, wonder of wonders. Wonder of wonders, Pili Plai. Since then, about 10 years passed. Keeping cheshbon, this is 50 years since they had first met by the Rebbe's wedding in Warsaw. And here we get to the point. In the year 1979, my youngest brother was married in the city of London. The whole family, my father, my mother, my sister, my brother-in-law, and I flew to the wedding in an airplane. On the way to London, we saw my father was preoccupied. Something was bothering him. I asked him to say what was wrong. He didn't want to say. Only after I asked several times, he told me, a few minutes after I left the house in Toronto, the neighbor, one of the dignitaries of our congregation, came to see me, rivers of tears pouring from his eyes. He said he would tell me a story he would not otherwise tell to anybody willingly, but that maybe I could help. Turns out that the daughter of this community leader wavered very much in her ritual observance. In the beginning, the parents didn't really know about it, because she hid it from them, but 2 weeks earlier, the great catastrophe became known to them. She had eloped with a Gentile to London. Since then, the atmosphere in the home was mamish Tisha B'Av. Mamish Tisha B'Av. All the efforts of relatives in London came to naught. Therefore, he asked my father, since he was traveling to London, maybe he would look into the matter, and God would be merciful. Maybe he could find the daughter and prevent her from descending into the depths of iniquity. Okay, this is a neighbor's daughter, who, if you're remembering from this story, that the Lubavitcher Rebbe had told him, what would happen if a neighbor's daughter, and where did she elope to? To London, which the Rebbe for the past 50 years, over 3 different meetings, had said that no matter where a Jew is, from Warsaw to London, from New York to London, and from Toronto to London, on the 5th night of Chanukah, we have this special ability to lift everything up. My father was a close friend of this neighbor and was affected greatly by the story. I also took it to heart and thought about what I could do for the case in London. The weddings were held at a good night, an auspicious hour. On the first night of the the Sheva Brachas, the 7 benedictions. My father turned to the bride's father and told him the story about the neighbor's daughter. Perhaps he had some advice. Who, where? Maybe he could look into the matter, do something. The bride's father, as soon as he heard the story, said to my father that he had no understandings of such matters, but he did have a friend who was a Lubavitcher Chassid, who Lubavitcher Rebbe always charged with all types of errands. The man's name was Reb Avram Yitzchak Glick, and if there's anybody who can help, it is this man who had already managed to save from the streets of Europe many confused souls. That night, the bride's father telephoned Reb Glick, listened to this, told him the story, and explained how pressing the matter was. Rabbi Glick asked for the telephone number of the girl's parents in Toronto. Maybe they knew some details that would help, like addresses, telephone numbers. Perhaps they would give some clue where to start searching. The whole London is a big place. Where are you supposed to find his person? Rabbi Glick promised to do what he could. I don't know where Rabbi Glick searched, but he went. Where he went, nor with whom he consulted. But one night, about 10 days later, my father and mother had decided to stay in London until after Chanukah. Rabbi Glick called the bride's father and told him to come immediately. The bride's father and my father hurried to Rabbi Glick's house. As they entered, they saw a girl sitting and crying. At the entrance of the salon, a Chanukah menorah was lit. Suddenly, as my father looked at the menorah, he saw 5 candles lit, and he almost fainted and fell to the ground. He remembered the strange sentence the Rebbe had told him some 50 years earlier, then 30 years earlier, and then 10 years earlier. What are the chances? The 5th Chanukah candle signifies the power of the Chanukah menorah, and the mission of every Jew is to illuminate even the darkest place, Warsaw or London, New York or London, Toronto or London. What will that zealous one do when his daughter wavers? With the Holy One, blessed be He, every Jew is an only child. With the previous Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, every Jew is Mibisar Chaltis Salim. There's no need to mention that the girl completely repented and became an observant Jew. There's also no need to mention that the zealous one shut his mouth and ceased speaking against Lubavitch. When my father returned to Canada, he made every effort to obtain an audience with the Rebbe. He felt a need, a spiritual duty after what had happened to see the Rebbe. But in those years, it had become very difficult to obtain a private audience. But the following month of Tishrei in the year 1980, my father succeeded seeing the Rebbe on the first night that a group of holiday visitors had a group audience. My father said that from all the emotions that were coursing through him, he could not utter anything during the audience. When he tried to tell the story, he would break into tears. The Rebbe heard just a few sentences, turned to my father, and said, the father-in-law, the Rayatz, Ki'ilu was like the Rayatz is doing, the Shver, has a very distant vision. Every time my father would tell this story, he would say that the real wonder was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Even more than his vision of events to come from 50 years beforehand was his heavenly humility of that he said, the Shver has a very distant vision. The chain of wonders has not stopped. On 14 Kislev 1989, exactly when the Sheva Brachas for my firstborn child ended, on the day which represented the passage of 60 years from the Rebbe's wedding in Warsaw, my father passed away. All just as the Rebbe had blessed my father, that he should rejoice at the wedding of his grandchild. We should be happy that this man, holy to God, dwelled among us. Since it is known that the righteous are greater in their death than they were in their lives, certainly the Rebbe will cause a flow of blessing, salvation, and comfort from on high to each and all until we merit to the promise of the verse, and a Redeemer shall come unto Zion, in accord with the holy will of the Rebbe, soon and in our time. Amen. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Greenwald. What can you possibly say to such a story? What can you possibly say? How can you explain? 50 years to be able to see the Ruach HaKodesh, 50 years, an exact case, an exact place, an exact night, an exact inyan. This is the Rebbe. These are the tzaddikim. L'chaim, l'chaim. I just had to share this story. L'chaim.